What's up, everyone? I'm Dimitar, and I'm a London-based SaaS entrepreneur and operator. I've been in the talent acquisition space for the better part of a decade, but spent the last couple of years building machine learning forecasting software for sales. After a brief hiatus, I'm back in the talent acquisition space, having recently joined Handshake, the world's largest early talent network, as head of EMEA. In this podcast series, I catch up with some of my old industry friends and thought leaders to discuss the latest trends in the emerging talent space. I speak to some of our employer partners who provide tactical advice on how to best identify, attract, and engage early talent. And lastly, I chat to some of my colleagues here at Handshake, giving you a behind-the-scenes peek into how the world's fastest-growing edtech company is being built.
So first things first, we normally start with a quick introduction. Now, I know in the sort of TA and broader HR world, you don't really need an introduction because everyone knows who you are, mainly because of Brainfood. Fair to say?
Fair to say, but I'm happy to do the intro, Dim, because I think you overstate my kind of prominence in the space. Like tons of people have no idea who the hell I am.
Yeah, well, look, this is what we're going to do. Not only are you going to do an intro, but I was thinking, with the Brainfood Tribune, you've kind of tapped into something really interesting. You have started unpeeling layers and sort of showing the true people behind, well, how would you describe it actually? What have you done with the Tribune?
It's exactly, your description was on the right track. It's like, let's get behind the persona and find out who the people are. Because we are living in the world where it's undeniable we've all got online personas now, remote working, distributed working. All our interactions are with avatars, and with 30-minute Zoom calls is like the max we can ever achieve in terms of human intimacy these days.
Yeah.
And I just realized that there's only so much information is ever exchanged in those types of circumstances, and oftentimes that information is transactional. It's efficient, and don't get me wrong, I like these efficient transactional Zoom calls. I'm a 15-minute guy on those. Hey. That's it. Just tell me what you want. I'll tell you where I can do it. Great, efficient. However, they're not relationship enriching because they are so focused on efficiency. And it just struck me, man, like one of the things I'm missing personally in my life is those like unscheduled, non-agenda driven interactions that I used to have with people.
Yeah.
You and I might go have a lunch. It would be 1 hour lunch. It'd turn into 2 hours, and it'd be like great because we talk all kinds of crazy crap. But in that time, what's happening is bits of information is being exchanged that we would not exchange in a scheduled time-bound scenario. Yep. And what the Brainfood Tribune is really designed to do in a weird way is to try and get some of that information. Like what is the biographical information that typically isn't shared in a short form because we don't have the mind space for it.
Yeah.
But if you were having dinner with somebody 5-6 hours, or you're having a few beers over the weekend, that information would be freely shared. Let's get that. Let's get people to tell their stories. And ultimately, dotted line back vaguely is to say, let's just remind ourselves that there's a lot of humanity out there.
And you've now done this for quite a few prominent figures in the recruiting world. The one thing that I always kind of think about is that you've escaped the spotlight in a way. So, when we kind of kicked off and we said, let's start with an intro, I thought we should give us a Brainfood Tribune type intro to kind of go a little bit deep. Obviously, state the obvious, but I'd love to hear more. And I kind of feel like, because I've known you for quite a few years, I know a lot of this, but I think it would be interesting for everyone else to hear a little bit more about who you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back.
I'm definitely not dodging it. I mean, there's a reason why I haven't done the Tribune thing myself. And that's just simply because it will feel like such a full stop on the project. I don't want it to ever be that. I think it should just be an ongoing and living thing. But yeah, I'm totally happy to answer any questions and go a bit deeper than the norm on this. So yeah, fire them at me, man.
Well,
let's
dude,
do it.
I thought the way to do this will be Hung Lee in his own words, right? So just talk about yourself. Like, if you were to give like a sort of a longer form introduction, where would you start? From childhood, how you came to be Hung Lee.
Yeah, I mean, childhood is now like in the Jurassic, man. Like I'm older than I look, so it's like going back a long way. But yeah, you know what? my kind of life journey as it is, I mean, I've kind of hit the halfway mark now. I did one of these like online tools where, you type in your parameters or whatever, and it'll predict how long you've got. And I came out like halfway. So it was like one of these where I realized, holy shit, I'm nearly there. And I just thought, okay, so how have I got here? But mainly by accident and usually not by plan. I'm not one of these forcing characters that, Hemingway style creates their own universe. I'm one of these folks that kind of tries to read the waves a little bit and bobs along in the right direction. And, hopefully I'll find myself on a welcoming shore if I guess that right. And that's generally been my way. Probably from a professional point of view, where it mattered is Web 1.0, obviously, when that came around, if that's still a viable term, all you sort of boomers and Gen Zers will probably understand what I mean by that. Web 1.0, essentially when eBay first came around, when people thought, e-commerce would completely transform things 10 years before it actually did. I was super excited at that moment. I just thought this is the moment that was as seismic as what COVID-19 feels now. And as a young person coming out of university, I was very keen to get involved in that type of world. So wanted to get involved in technology businesses, try to be a coder. I thought that would be a smart way to do it. Dim, let me tell you, typing out that one page of HTML took me about 3 days. It was like one of the worst experiences of my life. I managed to actually get a website up and running, which did actually convert me a job. It was like one of the, I wouldn't say they were first online CVs, but it probably was. And that was the plan. Let's create a little website. That would be my CV into the tech world. But I was so miserable, doing this forensic analysis of how I got that / right or wrong, all this type of stuff. It's such a detail oriented job to be a programmer. I realized that if I committed to it, the best I'd ever achieve would be mediocrity. And I'd be miserable being mediocre. So why do that? And I just thought, okay, how else do I get involved in the tech world without being a builder? And I didn't know anything about recruitment at the time, but I was just noticing a lot of these businesses saying, yeah, we're also recruiting for a recruiter. And I just thought maybe that would be one kind of way to iterate on my process. Again, no strategy, right? But I thought if I was a recruiter for a period of time, I'd be talking to loads of different tech companies. I'll probably figure it out in a year or two. And of course, having done it for a year or two, I ended up doing recruiting for 20 years. And here I am, man, speaking to you 20 years down the line. So that's the long story short.
Well, I kind of feel like you skipped a few chapters along the way, but obviously you've built multiple products and now, so you're not only you're a recruiter, but you're a founder, you're CEO, and now you obviously run Brainfood, which has branched into all sorts of cool things, so from the curated newsletter, which is read by, 20,000 plus people weekly, me being one of them, to the Brainfood Tribune that we discussed, which, as we mentioned, kind of shed some more light on who the people behind the faces are, so to speak, etc. But kind of looking at Brainfood, one thing that I find quite fascinating about it is that when you kind of think of the sort of the broader industry, not many people, I'd say, have the same bird's eye view as you do because of the amount of work you do to curate the newsletter, but also the amount of people that you speak to globally. And I appreciate now, it's all Zoom calls and everything else. And it's not like Hung being on a plane, 250 days a year, going to all sorts of places and speaking to people in person, but you still have retained those relationships and you still accumulate an awful lot of data and knowledge. So I thought a cool place for us to start, even though we started 30 minutes ago and I should have really hit record then, but a good place to start here would be, for me at least, to talk about the elephant in the room, COVID, obviously. And I know we were kind of exchanging messages the other day and kind of trying to guess what the future holds, but it would be good to hear your thoughts around what has happened and where that kind of leaves us. And I know you and I have spoken before it. I've given you, some nuggets from opinions that I've heard from other friends and kind of analysts in the industry, but would love to hear kind of your thoughts and what you've been hearing through the grapevine.
You know what, on this, Dim, there's kind of a developing consensus. Like, I don't know anybody that's saying, hey, this is going to just wash away. We're going to go back to normal. I think the consensus now that, hey, this is a seismic, it's a phase shift type of moment, where the world is going to look at like a very different place after this immediate sort of crisis for the pandemic is over. And a lot of the things that we really held as being true in business, in society, in work, maybe for the last 50, 60, even maybe longer period of time is going to be up for grabs. So yeah, I think it is that significant. It's going to be very interesting. I said to a friend of mine earlier, just before this called him actually, that even though the crisis is obviously a crisis with tragedy, lots of people have had public health problems. Of course, we've had thousands of people actually lose their lives prematurely as a result of this. And economic devastation goes without saying. It's difficult not to be interested in the moment, even with all of that sort of terrible things that are going on, because we are witnessing a revolutionary change. How economics works, how democracy works or doesn't. What is our relationship with communication technology? What's our relationship with other people? What's our relationship with companies, with governments, and all those types of things? Up for grabs. We're negotiating that future. And fascinating to observe it and maybe be a part of it.
Yeah, let's talk about this. I think, if I, what he said just kind of reminded me of the famous Lenin quote, that decades where nothing happens in weeks, where decades happen. And I thought, if I can quote Lenin, that would be definitely to you. But let's talk about that. So, one of the things that obviously, as you said, there's no denying this, seismic changes, lots happening, and a lot of those changes will be actually lasting and stay for good. A lot of them in the context of recruitment would have probably would have happened anyway, but they would have taken years to get to where we are now, and everything has been sort of compressed into a much shorter period of time, a few months. So let's talk about some of them. And obviously, with me recently joining Handshake, a lot of my interest now lies in early talent. So particularly keen to hear your thoughts around the shifts that we're seeing in that particular vertical, but also the broader TA industry.
Yeah, let's talk about the early talent. I think that's going to be super interesting, man. And congratulations, obviously, on the raise recently. That's awesome. I think this is also up for grabs, because you look at the university kind of business model, so to speak. That was already in trouble pre-COVID. Super dependent on international students, because how expensive is it to run these very old buildings in many cases? How expensive is it to, provision for all of these people on site and get everything in safe conditions and all that type of stuff? A lot of universities were not making a lot of money. A lot of universities at the very top edge, elite edge, were making a lot of money, but all of them were massively dependent on international students, because they would basically be paying and in effect subsidizing the education for the native students, which is why, governments generally really promoted it and enjoyed this. However, obviously, COVID-19 prevents international travel. You can imagine students now thinking, well, I ain't going to go to Australia anymore to do my year out. And so Australia loses that year's worth of this student being there, paying fees, spending money, typically from that mother country, and dumping it into that economy. It's like free chicken, So all that free chicken's gone. I think a lot of universities will end up going to the wall. I'm sorry to say. Kids are going to learn how to learn in a remote way, and in fact, they've been doing that anyway. If you look at, for instance, it's a trivial example, but you look at all the education material that's on YouTube these days. It's usually young people driving that. Makeup channels, even stuff like that. That's directed at young kids typically. Oftentimes the educator themselves is a young person and they've got millions of followers. Kids are learning from this channel rather than through an on-demand channel that they can choose. So lots of agency, the relationship we previously had between the education institution and the person being educated has been like one-way broadcast. Like you sit in this room, I'm going to just broadcast at you, and that's it. That's all you got. Now it's moving much more to that on-demand feel, which is true in a much consumer tech. Show me an example where on-demand has hit a market and it hasn't stuck. It's going to be dominant. So what does the university world look like how do they deliver on-demand services to a discerning audience that can choose from different courses? Are we going to see a situation where students may not necessarily be a member of one university, maybe a member of many universities? Will we see universities actually verticalize, if you like? I think that's an Andreessen Horowitz term, isn't it? Verticalize into like a very narrow topic. So they become super experts at deep learning, let's say. And if you are interested in deep learning, you will go to this particular college because they got the best courses. But to do it broad in the same way, I doubt it.
What do you make of the idea that going to university has never solely been about acquiring knowledge? Of course, big part of it is acquiring knowledge, making sure that at the end of it, you can actually land a job and kind of transition into the professional world. But a big part of it, and again, COVID has really changed this, has been about the social side of it, right? Kind of transitioning from, sort of adolescence to, to kind of being an adult officially, having those social interactions with other people, etc. And so how do you see this? Is this obviously, I hear what he's saying about the way in which we acquire, knowledge and learn drastically changing. Fair enough. But what happens to the other parts? Because again, I would argue that probably that's for a lot of people, that's even more important. And that's why, universities have been able to charge so much money, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with your assessment. There's two parallel types of education, right? And, many people have written songs about this. The real lessons you learn outside of the classroom. Of course, that's true. It's gone. There's no way you could sell the idea of, hey, come to my university town and network for 4 years. It's going to cost you this amount of money. Not happening. Right now, for instance, you can't do so because of the public health crisis. That's a huge break. There's a huge break for financial reasons. There's a huge break culturally as well for all of these kids. They're going to find other ways to do it. And once you've created these other systems, it's going to be very difficult that you then create a switching cost to go to what was normal before. Do you know what I mean? So I think you're right, but I think that period is gone. And I think we need to really rethink how those types of relationships are going to be remade. An example I would say is you look at online gaming. That's a wonderful sort of space to explore how people actually in a social setting connect, build relationships, exchange information, build tribes, build communities, build groups, networks, if you like. And it's all obviously done digitally and remotely. And I think we'll end up doing it probably via gaming, to be honest with you, or via some of the shared consumption of media.
So in the context of what I was asking earlier, in terms of which, no denial, things have changed, right? But some maybe temporarily, some are staying, right? So am I hearing that you think that the university model is going to be dismantled and everything will happen offline for good, like no more physical attendance?
It's not sustainable, mate.
Okay,
it's not sustainable from both sides. So the institution itself is running. I'd be interested to someone who's listening to this, who I'm sure there's a lot of early education folks out there that are listening. Tell me if I'm wrong, but what is the percentage of income you get from foreign students? Like, how significant is that? Let's not also forget, you layer on top geopolitical issues, US antagonism against China, for instance, which was a huge impact in terms of foreign students, by the way. So, okay, those kids aren't coming anymore, meaning that money is not coming anymore. Are you going to replace that? Who with? You ain't got another country that's going to come and dump a load of kids at you to do that. So I may be overstating it, but I think that essentially that's going to be a big loss and not a sustainable loss. Plus, I think you've got a lot of people in the US in particular really questioning the value of college education degree. The amount of cost that you need to take on board in the US in particular is extraordinary. And you've also got this chipping away at the value of the degree. You've got companies saying, hey, we don't need degrees. Look at the list of companies that are saying this these days. Google, Facebook, all of these big companies are saying, you know what, there's other ways to test for this.
Yeah, well, so that sort of gives us a good segue to jump into recruiting, because obviously having a university degree has been a good way of standardizing qualifications, I suppose, and skills, and saying, well, if you've got a degree from a tier 1 university, therefore must be a good candidate, which, as you and I both know, doesn't actually translate. But it has been used for decades as the benchmark for kind of landing a job, right? So assuming what he's saying is actually true, I don't know. I don't really have a strong opinion on this. I can see it going either way. But assuming that's the new world, and this is what happens in, I don't know what the timeline on this actually happening is. What does this mean for recruitment? How would I, as an employer, graduate talent, which is no longer going to be called graduate talent, I suppose, early talent, how do I go about finding the right people?
Yeah, dude, all of this, by the way, is still saying things like early talent market is going to be massive. It's going to be much more interesting and much more fluid, because it's simply not going to be a case where there's going to be a bifurcation of that early talent, saying what's a graduate, non-graduate, like we split people this way. We're probably not going to do it. I think it's super exciting for platforms like you guys, because, can you explore how this future looks like, and can you be the service that allows companies access to talent that may or may not come through traditional academic means? So it's going to be a super exciting moment for all of us. One of the things I think is true is that as a signal for capability, we know that the correlation between academic performance at a national level is not particularly sort of mapped to job performance. However, there is some evidence to say your academic performance at a relative level might be, meaning it's not the score you get, the objective score you get. It's the score you get in relation to your immediate peer group. So in other words, if you, for instance, had a privileged scenario, you went to private school, you got private tuition, you got parents, stable environment, lots of money, etc., you probably have your family set yourself up in a position where you're going to succeed, and you're probably going to get out straight A's, right? That doesn't tell you anything. Doesn't tell the employer anything. What is a better thing to assess is, how are those straight A's compared to the other students in your peer group? Did you outperform those people? Were you middling? Did you underperform those people? And it turns out there's some evidence to suggest where you perform where you are in relation to your peer group of the same circumstances is a better signal. So in other words, if you were in a different circumstance, you're in a state school, low graduation rate at university, traditionally impoverished, very diverse in terms of ethnicity and stuff like this. You're living in an impoverished environment, and the best anybody ever gets is a C. You get that C. You're going to do what?
But even in this scenario, you can see how university education or even college education sort of standardizes things. It gives you a heuristic to benchmark people against each other, because they have all kind of gone through the same institution. They have all been sort of assessed against the same criteria. So my question was, what happens, assuming that no longer exists? How do I know that, I don't know, Johnny here is better than Lucy, or Lucy is better than Johnny? Do you know what I mean? In the absence of any benchmarks.
Here's my theory on this, and this is true for all TA. All of these kind of ways in which we've been recruiting so far have all been trying to sort of create proxies to generate these signals. In other words, we want to reduce the risk that this person is a poor hire or a poor fit, and we want to increase the likelihood that it's a great hire and a great fit. That's what we all want. Everyone as part of the stakeholder process wants this. However, because we haven't found an efficient way to do it, we've just invented a bunch of exercises that we hope will give us some signals. So we're pattern matching on all of this type of stuff. Now, let's say we can't do that anymore. The way in which I think we'll generate this signal is going to be just moving the assessment closer to the actual work required. So in other words, we're going to run more trial projects. We're going to get people working at a much younger age. And this is where we kind of need to renegotiate what we think about child labor and all that type of stuff. But we're going to get people kind of connecting with the world of work at a much earlier age, and then picking up signals of a totally different type, not assessment-based signals in terms of going through a gate, but really observing how people operate in a world that is approximate to the world of work. So this is real world assessments. This is work trials, almost like the apprenticeship system of old. But why could that not be applied to all kinds of work rather than just blue collar stuff?
Yeah, I totally see how this applies, once you start moving towards the middle of the funnel. And maybe I'm sort of kind of looking at the old paradigm here. But if you think of what happens right now in the world of graduate recruitment, most employers still operate using the following framework. They will spend an obscene amount of money trying to raise awareness, build their employer brand, and have as many people apply. They will do some sort of initial screening based on, as you say, signaling that is arguably not that relevant: education, degree, background, motivation, etc. And then they would put you through some sort of assessment, which is not actually even based on the job itself, but it could be some sort of psychometric assessment. It could be some sort of, I don't know, numeric test, you name it. But that would be kind of the way. So I get how, we can start replacing that part of the funnel with something which is way more aligned with the job that is expected of you to do. What happens to the top of the funnel, though? This is kind of, where I keep on kind of going back to this thing, because, in my head is like, this creates actually more work, if anything. And I understand what you're saying. This current system is by no means great. I have my questions around, education, the way we've been receiving it now. But in terms of using the system to basically, let me rethink this. Using the current system as I said, as a heuristic to kind of think of, as building top of the funnel and ensuring who goes into that funnel, that kind of seems to work. Arguably not the, it could be improved, sure, but I kind of feel like if it's not there, what else do we do? Do you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean. One thing I would say to this is that our mental model of the funnel itself is incorrect. Or not incorrect, but it kind of belongs to a world that doesn't exist anymore. And we can persist in using it, and it will probably, it'll have some drag factor. It will, you'll still recruit, you'll still possibly hit your number, let's say. But is that the purpose? Is the purpose to just hit a number of headcount, or is the purpose to hire, people who you think are going to add most value to your business over the longest period of time? I think the funnel is just generally going to be abandoned as an idea. It's going to be a lot more long form interactions with people, long-term relationship building, really from way back when. So you imagine football is a good example, soccer training, those clubs get involved really at these kids at the age of 6, 7 years old. They're not thinking, oh, we're going to convert this person in a space of like 3 exercises into an active or productive employee. No, they're going to think, you know what, we need to speak to hundreds of kids, thousands of kids, maybe get them kind of start our monitoring process at that point, get it to a stage where ultimately we're going to maybe get one person through the youth ranks and turns into a pro for us. I think we're going to go through a similar model, really long form, different tooling needed. No question, different skills needed. Is it still called recruitment? Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like this is still a funnel, to your point, kind of stretched over a very long period of time, but it is a funnel. And I think, little known fact, I used to play for my local club when I was 9 until 13. And, there's a self-selection because the process is so long. Even if you're performing well at some point, because you lose interest in the sport, you might drop off. And I think, long story short, I think this is still a funnel, right?
It may well be. I mean, another way to look at this, though, is that the funnel really doesn't allow the individual to escape. It's like you're literally kettling these people down to a certain group of people. Whereas if we rethink the metaphor, we need to really decouple the stages of the funnel. So right now, a funnel is essentially a sequence of assessment events that go in a particular order. We set up those events. It's A, B, C, D, E. And everyone goes through that. This is what we call our recruiting process. And in fact, we're very proud that it's a universalized process. Everyone goes through this. However, do people want to go through this at the same speed? Do people have any choice or sense of agency in that? Especially if you're a highly skilled in demand person, maybe you don't want to go through a process of this type. Maybe there are other ways to validate your capability, which these individual events are looking to feasibly do. Perhaps there's other ways to validate that, and you don't necessarily need to go through. So I see there's some parallels in engineering in my view. So the funnel itself is basically a waterfall method. It is a hydrological metaphor, it's like the water only flows one direction. We've set it up like a waterfall. And therefore it has all of the criticisms that you might get from waterfall. You capture requirements at the top, you think you know what you're doing before you even spoke to anybody. Then you've set up your assessments. Your primary aim really is to control applicant flow rather than assess the number of people. So you throw in a bunch of stuff that is irrelevant, like degrees, in order to try and control the applicant flow. And then you set it all up to a crescendo where ultimately, we've hired 100 people. Now, an engineer looking at that will think that's a crazy way to make decisions. What you want to do is decouple all of those systems. You want to decouple all of those stages so that they can operate in any order. Why can you not do D, C, F? Why do you need to go A, B, C? Because you're still collecting the same information. Why could you not parallel process some of these things? Because you've now decoupled it. You don't have to go through the sequence. Why do they need to go at the same speed? Maybe some people really want to rush through this, which is great for us, but other people might want to take some time. You need to have a system that allows that to happen.
Haven't we already seen baby steps in this direction with COVID? So maybe a month ago, I was chatting to Bill Borman, and he was saying that, maybe actually it was 2 months ago. I can't remember now, but it was one of the things that he mentioned was that the process, and this is not in the graduate world, but overall the process is getting pretty streamlined, and we're basically losing a bunch of stages of the assessment, right? So instead of having 5-6 in-person conversation, now we only have one in-person conversation because of COVID. Everything else happens online, and as a result, the entire process has actually being halved, I think you said, right? So this is kind of arguably already happening to a far less extreme extent compared to what you're describing. But I would say, these are sort of baby steps in the direction that you're describing.
I actually think that's a different sort of experience. I think that's an optimization based on removal of physical proximity, right? So it's a different sort of trend, although it's orthogonal to what I'm talking about, because being remote actually will promote the idea of work trialing, and it will promote the idea of having less commitment of making a decision. Let's not forget the reason why we set up the funnel is because we're terrified of making a wrong choice. It's way too risky to make a decision on hiring somebody. This is why we throw a huge funnel in there. Get through this process, and that will make me feel better about taking this risk. That's essentially what recruiting has been for the last 50, 60 years or so, particularly white collar people.
But there's a good reason why we fear making the wrong decision, right? There's a huge cost that goes into
100% justified fear. It's just a completely stupid way to reduce that fear, because all it does is reduce the fear. It doesn't actually make the bad high go away. It's literally, you want to put the super skeptic view on it. All recruiting is basically confidence building rituals. It's you may as well pick people out of a hat, and would you get a better result? Who knows? Maybe you would. Someone please experiment. However, what you're able to do to truly de-risk is to see these people operate in some way related to the job that they're doing. That's the best way to do it. Why do you need proxies is the question I'm asking. If you can instead observe this person behaving in the context, in the job context, in the collegiate context that they're in, that is the better signal. And in fact, that's when we always refer to when we hire the people we know. We always think, hey, referrals are the best hires. Why? Because we've already seen this person work already. We're comfortable with this stuff. We don't need to retest this person because I am sure they're able to deliver this quality to us. You look at the founding groups of any startup, I would imagine similar, even with Handshake. They probably knew each other in advance. They didn't go through a recruiting funnel to get there, right?
They went to the same university though.
Right,
but they didn't
put each other through a recruiting funnel. They knew enough about each other's work through the work itself, and therefore didn't need the confidence building rituals.
I'm in agreement 100%. My point again was that university has been, used as a proxy, especially for like early talent, right? It's assumed that if you've gone to a top university, you've gone through some sort of rigorous process to get in there. Now, to your point earlier, certain people, depending on socioeconomic status, might have had an unfair advantage to get there. And I think the what you said about sort of adjusting and making this relative makes a lot of sense. But again, as a proxy, I do see this as an effective way of sort of potentially predicting future success. Not necessarily in the workplace, but yeah.
It does. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, though. I mean, it's very hard to peel out the causality of this. So if I hired a bunch of Oxford grads, you know what? They're definitely going to be smart, and you know what? They're definitely going to be probably pretty good, I would say. But how much of that is based on my positive assessment of this? It's like you're a participant observation, but participant observer and all of this type of stuff. People aren't just discrete entities walking into empty rooms and suddenly being geniuses. You've created a situation where they may or may not succeed. You're right. I'm not entirely dismissing education, by the way, because it does give you some signals. There's no doubt. But it's crude, and maybe one of the things we need to try and do is to just to add some more nuance and to find other signals also, which should be good guidelines for us, which hopefully we're starting to see. We're starting to see a lot of the graduates coming, or shall we say, young early talent coming into the world of work these days. They're involved in a lot of online stuff. They're plugged in from your dot, really. Digital native, I guess, is the term. And that gives us an opportunity, because it gives us an opportunity really to study a lot of the stuff that they do and how does it map to potential for future performance. It's no longer the black box that it once was. Back in my graduation days, remember I'm from the Triassic. There was no data on me, right? There was literally no data. The only information anybody had was, this kid got a 2-1 from a reasonably good university, give him a job. But these days we've got lots more opportunities and lots more ways in which employers can figure out whether this person is worth that risk.
Well, how do you collect the data is my point. And again, like maybe I'm biased here, because if you think of like the Handshake model, which I think is absolutely genius in this regard in terms of, from an entrepreneurship and sort of business standpoint. But one of the unique things about Handshake is that we obviously partner closely with universities, which allows us to then curate, for lack of a better term, the data, which is academically verified, that makes this elusive demographic, the 18 to 24 years old, you can basically allow for employers to directly search based on criteria that has been verified by the relevant universities, right? LinkedIn have been trying to do the same thing for years. They haven't been able to, because the taxonomy needed to kind of run searches, and LinkedIn relies on professional experience. So one of the arguments you make is, okay, we get involved in work way earlier, so we kind of build this professional experience needed. And again, if an employee is to kind of discover us, they can use something like the LinkedIn using professional experience. In the absence of that, though, in the absence of universities, like, again, I keep on kind of circling back to the same thing, because I'm trying to see how this works from a practical standpoint, and maybe I'm too close to how changed it right now.
I think it's pretty obvious, man. I mean, ultimately, these young people, I would imagine, and if you're a young person listening to this, please correct me if I'm wrong, because it's, again, a long time since I've interacted with anybody at that age group. But I would guess that they, at that time, may have an interest. I think there'll be a heightened interest these days, actually, in terms of their marketability, their skills, what they want to do in the future, et cetera, whether that's in an academic or non-academic context. And I think there's a way in which they will maybe get involved in programs or get involved in some sort of online interactions, which may be managed by a company like Handshake. You may be able to start tracking these other signals outside of academic classroom stuff. That would be even more interesting to an employer, because let's say, wouldn't it be cool, for instance, if I was an employer and I was looking for someone who I thought, I need this type of mindset, who can handle these types of problems. Typically, they're interested in this, and maybe they're educated in this also. That type of like 360-degree view, that would be absolutely superb. So I would say that the answer is there. It's not like just being fixated on the academic sort of criteria.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what Handshake does. And, again, the reason why I keep on circling back to the university is because the partnership with the university is what allows us to standardize these data. So if I run a search as an employer for, the various criteria that you listed, I know that I'm getting a standardized search result instead of, the thing that I at least, and I've not, admittedly, I've not thought about this before, is like, how do you accumulate all this data and how do you catalog it in a way that allows you to search in a standardized way? Do you see what I mean?
That's the platform challenge, mate. That's what
Yeah.
Handshake will either conquer this new area or not. I mean, we struggle with that on Workshape, right? Like, how do you actually describe different activities in a standard way so that everyone can understand it? And it's literally about creating a new language, man. It's creating a new language to describe people's talent, people's ability. And I don't think there's any one business that's managed that. I think right now it's locked down to textual data. And as you say, we're looking for these signals, but they're really crude. It's almost like we can't be satisfied with, a Stone Age spear when, the world has gone to metallurgy. We're at the point where we need to have these new tools. So I think there is a technical challenge, there's no doubt. Codifying what someone knows how to do and what they want to do, they're important sort of actions.
I think it's, I sorry to barge in here. I think more than a technical, I think it really is a taxonomy challenge, right? This is again why I brought LinkedIn
that's
earlier.
actually what I meant. Yeah, that's what I meant.
And that's why I think, when you're saying it could be Handshake, I think Handshake have already, and this is one of the reasons why I was so excited to join, when you think of like how long it's taken for someone to actually crack this, again, the reason why you haven't been able to do this, say, on LinkedIn, even though every working professional is on there, is because the taxonomy is not needed. And I think the brilliant thing about the Handshake business model is the partnership with the university, which is why I keep on struggling with the idea of this goes away, which, arguably could, as you said, then what next? The taxonomy piece falls apart because right now, ineffective as the system might be, it actually provides a unified taxonomy for recruiters and graduate employers to search and target people, right? Do you see what I mean? If everyone starts building their profile independently and there's no standardized way of, and I'm not saying they should be, but, up until now, that's been the case. There has been a standardized way of showing who you are and what you do. Do you know what I mean?
Listen, the standardization is exactly what the service, the platform needs to provide. And the challenge is to persuade the young talent to do it. Or you could potentially, it may not be a consent-driven thing. You could simply layer something on top. Although you run into GDPR problems there, I would imagine. But there's other ways to try and do it where you can kind of put a score on people on various criteria based on this internal system that you've created. So yeah, it's a taxonomy challenge, and that's probably going to be the decisive factor. You're right that LinkedIn's kind of crisis is that obviously they're fixated on professional work, professional experience, and rightly so, by the way. But basically what I think is that barrier between professional and non-professional is going to start kind of fading away. There may not be a situation where suddenly you're emerging in stages of life in the same way. I can totally see a situation where someone who is still predominantly in education, but also does 10 hours a week as a job, and then as they get older, they may go to 30 hours a week in a job, but continue their educational side. So the barrier, this big kind of phase shift change of now you're educated, now you go professional. That break. That type of shift, I think, is not really what we're going to have.
Yeah, I think you touched upon this earlier on the two different occasions with sort of your professional experience commencing a lot earlier, right? That's kind of one of the shifts that you anticipate. And I think you mentioned that this is already, largely happening in the tech world. So for a lot of developers, and the example that always springs to mind is my co-founder from my last company, Sven, who started coding when he was 8, right? So by the time, before he's even go to university, he's got like tons of professional experience, right? And he comes out of university. At that point, he's got a good decade of writing code, building apps and everything else. But in LinkedIn, if you look at him, he's a junior software engineer somewhere because he has just graduated with a degree in computer science, and that's kind of what follows.
This is exactly right. I mean, look, developers are, I think, in many respects, the lead edge of how this works. Because you're right. I was speaking to Tank, one of my co-founders at Workshape. He started coding at the same age, like ridiculously young. And he was doing professional grade work at the age of 13. Now it was like, okay, can you imagine this actually going beyond tech design, media production? Yes, you can. Have you seen those kids on TikTok? They
Absolutely.
can absolutely do it. So we've got to rethink things like child labor as a truth, because we've kind of used that as an industrial era protection to say, hey, we don't want to send kids in down chimneys, or these 5-year-olds shouldn't be sticking their hands into these machines. Yes, we should not have this. But at the same time, we've now created a situation where kids cannot be financially compensated for legit work that they're doing. You know what I mean? That doesn't involve this danger. So if you're a 15-year-old kid, like, can you even make money on TikTok or YouTube or whatever? And I'm thinking maybe you can't. I think, no, we've got to change that. Yes, we need to put child protections in place, and make sure that people are not put in danger. But at the same time, I don't see why we should refuse their compensation, because that's kind of like slavery. There was in Latin America was actually a really interesting example of this, where there was a political movement led by young people who wanted to work for wages. And these were like sub 16-year-old kids, but because of some sort of law that they had over there, probably just a carryover from colonial times, they weren't actually able to be paid a wage because of so-called child protection, actually segued into child sort of exploitation and what was in effect slavery. So
they were still able to work, but not being compensated for it.
They had to work because they were totally impoverished. But they had no worker protections as a result of it, because they had to work gray market. I'm Chinese, man. I worked pre-16. Of course I did. But had to be gray market because, you know what, I couldn't be legally employed for that. So we need to rethink this. We need to, of course, maintain the spirit of these legislations, which is to protect people from being exploited, particularly young people who tend to be more vulnerable for exploitation. But we can't sort of adhere to a rule which then goes on to actually exploit them in a different way. You know what I mean? I see if you're a 14-year-old kid and you're an amazing TikToker, why should you not make money beyond just sponsorship or whatever? Why could you not do a professional job for a company advising them on how to do TikTok? Yes, you should.
Yeah. Dude, we're totally out of time, but we have covered so much ground. And I think we've just kind of opened another very big topic here, which I think calls for another episode in the coming months. So look, thanks again for the time. And I shall look forward to having you on again, man. It's been a pleasure as always.
Dim, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. As you can see, I would be talking forever if you didn't shut me up. So thank you everyone for listening.
You got pretty fired up at the end as well. So that's what we like.